I'll do a brief introduction and I'll hand over to B. So welcome to this morning's e-Memoir webinar. We're looking at an update on the funding of learning support for apprentices and trainees, meeting the needs of learners and audit requirements. We like to keep these sessions as interactive as possible, so feel free to keep questions coming. You don't have to wait till the end. You can ask away at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. If you're watching this webinar on a video recording and you have any questions, then the contact details will be available at the end on the final slide, or you'll be able to find them on the slides which accompany this webinar. And I'd encourage you to also get in touch with us and share these with your colleagues. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my microphone and I'm going to hand over to Beej. Thanks a lot, Beej.
Thanks very much, Marek, and good morning, everyone, to today's webinar, which is looking at some of the issues around the funding of learning support for apprentices and trainees. When I talk about trainees, I mean on pre-apprenticeship programs and traineeships. I think the key message, and I suppose this message is one that's been reiterated several times in the last few years, particularly with the reforms in apprenticeship funding, the transition from apprenticeship frameworks to standards, and obviously from the 1st of September in light of the new education inspection framework, is that a lot of work has been done over the last 20 years in how best to support apprentices who, after all, are learning in the workplace predominantly, even though they will have some off-the-job training, which might be in a college, a training provider, or any other setup that, or any other setting for the learning. Is that in light of the Little Report, the work that was done by the Maynard Review, and more recently the Learning and Work Institute projects, as well as the work done by ETF on inclusive partnerships, inclusive apprenticeships, is that I think there's still some anxiety, particularly in the part of some providers, A, how to get the funding for learning support, and B, once you've got the funding, to make sure you deliver the actual support that you planned, and how effective is that support in making an impact on the individual learner in terms of their retention, the completion of the apprenticeship program, and obviously progression to either further training, to a promoted post, or just in terms of retaining the post. So I want to look at this partly from the viewpoint of how to improve the quality of delivery and how to make sure that you do identify individual needs and make the best provision for those needs, but also to make sure that that is then recorded properly for purposes of the ILR, for your claim, and obviously for audit, as well as clearly for inspection. And this has very much come from some work we've done recently with a network of training providers, predominantly doing apprenticeships, who had some anxieties about A, securing the funding, and B, making sure that they were able to deliver the learning support to their apprentices in the most appropriate way. So important sometimes to start with definitions, because we talk about learning support funding, and learning support in terms of that terminology. But obviously, let's go back to its original terminology, which was additional learning support. And we know that that was providing direct support to individual learners over and above that which is normally provided within a standard learning program. So we normally provide apprentices with support through mentors, coaches, through the workplace tutors, through review meetings, through the 20% off the job training, whatever setting that takes place in, as well as delivering the functional English and maths. So this is when it's additional, because the learner has got a need that's been identified or disclosed and assessed. And that, of course, is very critical in terms of the Equality Act, in terms of inclusiveness, and making sure that we comply with what's in the commitment statements that are agreed between the providers, the employers, and the individual apprentices. But the point to note there is that learning support is only available to us learners on funded programs. So whether it be on a levy funded program, or if they're with a smaller employer, which is a non-levy co-investment program, these would all be eligible to be supported through additional learning support. The other thing to note is that the additional learning support is not just for learners on program. It obviously has a critical role in actually allowing people to access the program in the first place. And that was a particular emphasis of both the Little Report and the Maynard Review, in that very often there were barriers to learners being able to access apprenticeships and traineeships because of their individual needs. Now, where this need might arise from, it could be from a learning difficulty and or disability, or from support required to be able to that learner to progress, to take up an opportunity, to be employed, and that can include social needs as well, or from a literacy, numeracy, or language support requirement, particularly if English is not the first language spoken in that person's home. So it's important to sometimes go back to those definitions and just to reiterate how important the word additional is above that and that which we normally provide to apprentices and trainees. Now, for trainees, and I just want to spend a few moments on this, there are actually two sources of funding for learning support for a trainee. So if they're on a pre-apprenticeship program of less than, say, 6 months or less, where a large proportion of the program is a work placement or work placements, normally doing if English and Maths if they haven't already attained them, and obviously a flexible program can include a short course which might be vocational or technical. If they're 16 to 18-year-olds, then the funding comes through the 16 to 19 funding allocation and methodology, which is based on the total number of hours that that traineeship would include, and that will determine the funding band. The disadvantage funding there will come from two sources. If the learner has not had a prior attainment in English and Maths at grade 4 and above, then there would be some disadvantage funding of £480. If they were a full-time trainee, it would be less, by the way, if they were part-time, depending which band. And that would be per subject. Now, that's not directly attributed to the individual trainee because it's actually based on a lagged effect. So this would be based on previous performance of previous English and Maths GCSE at Key Stage 4 performance of previous groups of learners. But nevertheless, you know, if you've got 50 learners and each one of them generates £480, say, per learner for not having either English or Maths, you know, that's a significant amount of funding which goes into the disadvantage pot, which is then available to your institution to spend in a way that's appropriate. And a lot of that will be what we call low cost learning support, where you're certainly not going to be spending more than £6,000 on any individual learner. If you do need to spend more than £6,000 on an individual trainee, then they would become high needs learners, and that would mean that not only would you be drawing down their core funding for their traineeship, possibly some disadvantage funding, either because of postal code or because of prior attainment in English and Maths, but also at least £6,000 would be allocated to you. Again, it would be on a lag number effect, so it would cover last year's learners. And then if they needed more than £6,000 and they were identified as a high needs learner, the local authority of that 16, 17, 18-year-old, or 19 to 24 if they've got an education healthcare plan, would be obviously any top-up funding would be available from their home authority. So that's how 16 to 18-year-olds are covered through that methodology. If you've got a 19 to 24-year-old who's not on an apprenticeship, but funded through the adult education budget, which can now in some cases be devolved to a combined authority or done through the ESFA, then once you've identified the person has the need and assessed that need, there is £150 per month available for that learner for each month that the learning support is being provided. If the £150 in any one month is not enough to support that learner, because they might have a moderate learning difficulty, they might have a literacy or numeracy, or they might have a disability, then that additional funding above £150, which you claim through the ILR, is available for you if you've got the evidence, and that's the key thing. For audit purposes, it's important that you do have the evidence of actual cost in any month if they're above £150, and that would be claimed periodically from the ESFA through the earnings adjustment statement. So I'll come back to the earnings adjustment statement because that's obviously very important for apprentices as well. So those are the two sources of learning support funding for trainees doing maybe a pre-apprenticeship program or a traineeship. Before we move on, are there any questions about how learning support is funded for those two types of learners?
Yeah, feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point if you have any questions there. And again, if you have anything you feel would be better communicated using the microphone, let myself or Bees know. Thanks, Bees.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a point raised by one of you about the disadvantage funding for 16, 17 and 18-year-olds. It isn't earmarked when it comes into your institution, where you're a college, a local authority, a school or a training provider with direct funding for 16 to 18-year-olds. When it comes into you, that funding is actually a block. It's what we call block 2 of the disadvantage uplift. And that is not attributed to the learners you currently have. It's a function of the learners that you had in the previous year, because it's a lagged effect. That is available for the institution to spend as it sees best, and clearly then you decide how to use that, maybe to support a trainee that might have a learning difficulty or a disability at a certain rate. That is then obviously claimed through that would then be part of your total allocation that comes to you for based on the numbers that you had in the previous year at the rate at which those were funded. And if you want to spend it on low-cost learning support, literacy support, that's your decision. I think the key thing is there to be able to demonstrate that that has gone through a process of identifying the individual needs and how best those needs have been met. If it comes to more than £6,000, the cost of supporting an individual trainee, then that learner becomes a high needs learner, 16 to 18. They don't need an education healthcare plan if they're 16, 17, 18. They do if they're 19 to 24. And they need that to be classified as high needs. Then what you've got there is a support that will come partly through the core program, partly through the first £6,000, which is also in your allocation that's given to each year by the ESFA. And any top up, you'll negotiate for an individual learner against their individual needs with their home authority. And that's how it works for the 16 to 18 trainees. That's great. Thanks for that question. Now, there is a process, and I think it's important to recognise that when it comes to apprentices, in any of the guidance to providers or employer providers or those of you that might be involved as providing support as a subcontractor, there is quite clear statements in all of those documents in terms of the rules, the regulations, the policy, but also will be contained within things like your evidence file, as well as the commitment statements, that learning support is there available under the terms of the Equality Act. And that is there to enable people with a learning difficulty and or disability to access an apprenticeship. And that means obviously including the cost of completing the apprenticeship. So the type of support you provide on program, whether it be additional staffing, smaller group size, adaptations to equipment, special reviews, case conferences, etc., and any other things that you do which would not normally be associated with an individual apprentice. That is the additional bit. But it also includes the cost of meeting needs in endpoint assessment. So please remember, if a learner needs a 10-point assessment on an apprenticeship standard, any support like an amanuensis or extra time, you do recognise that and claim that through the ILR if possible. If not, if it's additional to the £150 per month, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it'll be done through the earnings adjustment statement. So, and remember, also, it doesn't just mean those apprentices that you've assessed and had a diagnosis of the learning difficulty, but also those who self-declare a learning difficulty and disability using the appropriate codes on the ILR. But remember, this is critical because the funding obviously is going, in the case of a main provider and employment provider, directly to that training provider that provides the training. If it's a supported route, i.e. a subcontractor, the subcontractor has got to know it's the main provider that's got to do all of this. And of course, they will have to make sure that the learning support is provided appropriately. And the transfer of funding from the main provider to subcontractor is, I think, still a bit of an issue, because you cannot subtract any management costs for that, because the management costs are already assumed in the overheads. So wherever possible, 100% of the funding should be transferred to support the individual apprentice, because that's the additional element of this. It's also important to note that in any of the apprenticeship guidance, you'll see that learning support must not be provided to deal with everyday difficulties, something I came back to. If you find that there are some difficulties, like travel, for example, or other issues like significant adaptations, you can, of course, support the learner through an additional source of funding to the ESFA, which is not additional support funding using that source of funding through the ESFA, but you get that from the DWP in terms of access to work. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. So that's just a sort of, that's a clear statement in terms of any guidance about what learning support is available to apprentices. All apprentices, whether with a college, training provider, local authority, whether they're on a framework or a standard, whether it's levy funded or non-levy funded, have entitlements contained in law to be supported if we've identified individual needs. I think it's an important statement to make. I think in terms of MIS systems, I'll come back to that, but one of the things that I think it's important is that you do record everything on the ILR as is required by you if you're going to claim funding through the ESFA, even for a levy-funded learner, because for a levy-funded learner, learning support actually comes directly from the ESFA to you, the provider. It doesn't come through the levy or any agreed price that you have or any funding band you agree with the employer. So it is public funding, and therefore you've got to have the appropriate recording in the ILR, and that's then reconciled against what you actually do and your spending, and provide the audit evidence should an auditor ask to see. I think so using the ILR is the first place. If you want good systems to record and manage learning support, then there are a range of very good systems. ProMonitor, some of you might use Cognosys, some of you might use Atlas, whatever system, ABS, they all have what I call the bolt-ons that allow you to record cost as accurately as possible, and those costs obviously would then be reconciled against what you've actually claimed, as well as obviously seeing the impact, as well as recording the nature of the support you've provided. And that's all characterized by this little diagram, which shows requirements of all providers, irrespective of whether, whatever context the apprenticeship happens. We need to have a thorough assessment, even for those people that have self-disclosed. I think it's important to assess the extent of their need. You then obviously have to make sure that the information is available to the learner, to the employer, and obviously that data is then obviously going to be collected for the purposes of the ILR. But obviously that it's important to, if they've got a sponsor, or for example, if they're a younger apprentice, to make sure the guardians are aware of what support's available. So that's your plan and how you're going to effectively deliver the plan. Then you deliver the plan, record and monitor how much you've spent on delivering the support, which could be support in the workplace, support on the job training, could be a smaller group size, could be additional literacy and numeracy workshops, whatever the identified need is and how best you're going to meet it, but to record progress. And this is why things like ProMonitor, Cognosys, and other systems are very good at doing that. As I said, you choose the ones that might do that. And then to record all the evidence, all the outcomes, all the results of the support in the evidence pack, and then keep evidence of the assessment of the needs. So I think the evidence pack is very important, as is the commitment statement, which shows the degree and the nature of the support you provide. And then that is all reported in the ILR, or in the earnings adjustment statement if you're claiming more than £150 in any 1 month. So I think that process is critical. The source of learning support can be anything that indicates that the person needs additional help to what would have been ordinarily provided. So it can be based, for example, on functional skills tests such as BKSB. And that might indicate that they need help with the literacy or they need help with their maths. I know the evidence looks a bit ambiguous, but I think it's important that what you've got to identify is that if that learner was provided the English and maths in the normal way, would they be able to achieve it? In other words, a normal way would be as with any other apprentice who doesn't have difficulties with English and maths. If they've got the difficulties with English and maths, and that's not the case for all the rest of the cohort, then I think you'd have that indicated either through some kind of form of testing, such as BKSB, or through some kind of assessment, which you might use, such as Cognosys or SkillScan or whatever. So I think it's got to be based on the the fact that there's some rigor in the way in which you're assessing that individual need. Thanks for the point. So how is it funded? Well, in apprenticeships, whether it's young people or adults over the age of 19, all of the funding for learning support comes through the ESFA in England. It is standard £150 per month that you can claim, depending obviously on how many months you provide the support. You might provide it for the whole length of the apprenticeship, or you might provide it in chunks, so there could be breaks in the support, in which case you've got to record each start and each end date for each episode of learning support, and it's claimed through the ILR. Now, that means obviously you've got to enter that appropriately on the individual record. You've got to show the source of the learning support, and there are guidance on that. And obviously that is then got to take account of how long they're on the apprenticeship program, whether they withdraw early, etc. And in some cases, the support can extend beyond, for example, the completion of the framework, or beyond them accessing the endpoint assessment if they still haven't, for example, completed the rest of their program. Or obviously with endpoint assessment, you'd assume that they'd completed all the elements of the program before they went through the gateway. If you find that £150 in any 1 month is not enough, and by the way, it's a standard amount, it's just assuming that's the average that is needed each month to support learners with learning support needs. How it's been calculated is another issue, but that is the sort of standard approach. If you need more than £150, only if you need more, then you've got to evidence it. And I'll show you a little example. And that is got to be evidenced, and it's then got to be claimed, not through the ILR, but through the earnings adjustment statement. Again, if you're not an MI or data person, ask your MI team to explain how that works. You also use the earnings adjustment statement if you deliver part of an apprenticeship in less than 1 calendar month, say for example after a break in learning, then obviously if it's less than a month, you can't use the ILR to claim the £150. Then you would claim it all through the excess learning support column in the earnings adjustment statement. Now, it's also important to note that some of your 16 to 18-year-olds who are apprentices and 19 to 24-year-olds with an education health plan, or those who are in care, they will also have earning you additional funds from the ESFA, particularly, for example, the incentive payments of £1,000 that come to you, the provider, and also go to the employer, and as in 2 instalments of £500 each, as well as for care leavers, the bursary that's now available, has been available for the last year. Now, those are additional funds to the learning support. They're not to replace these are incentive payments for both you and the employer to take on younger apprentices or apprentices who have got education and healthcare plans or are in care. Now, there is a ceiling of £19,000 in any 12-month period. So if you find that the learning support cost for an apprentice comes to more than £19,000, then you claim not excess learning support. There's what we call exceptional learning support, and that has to come from central funds. If it's a 19 to 24-year-old and you're claiming this, then you'd have to have a letter to explain why that learner's not got an education healthcare plan and therefore not being supported through the top-up funding from their local authority. Now, usually you've got to indicate these to the ESFA in advance. It's very difficult to claim exceptional learning support for learners after they've started the program, after you've knew they were coming. And I know that's a difficulty because it's not always able to predict, it's not always easy to assess, but usually there would have been some negotiation that would have been taking place before if the learner had more exceptional needs. In terms of the £1,000 incentives I talked about in the previous slide, yeah, since the reforms of the funding formula in 2017, 16 to 18-year-olds for all employers, levy paying and non-levy, attract 2 incentive payments. One that goes to the provider of £1,000 in 2 instalments, £500 against them being retained to 90 days and being retained to the end of the year, and £1,000 that goes to the employer, which is an incentive for that employer to take on young people. If that employer, by the way, is a small employer with less than 50 employees, they actually get that incentive payment on top of the fact that they don't pay anything towards the cost of the actual apprenticeship program. Remember, smaller employers, non-levy paying employers who have got less than 50 employees, any 16 to 18-year-olds, or any of the other categories of learners, 19 to 24-year-olds with education and health care plans, would not require the employer to make any contribution at all, but they would receive the incentive payments on top of it. So I think that's something that's well worth picking up. Thanks for the question. If you find that English and Maths delivery up to level 2 extends beyond the apprenticeship program end date, particularly for frameworks, then up until that point where the learner has achieved the level 2 English and Maths functional skills, you can get learning support if that learner has got an identified need. For example, it might be a learning difficulty, it could be dyslexia, dyscalculia, or it could be a disability of some nature. The other point to note, that the employers are not required to contribute to the cost of learning support because it is fully funded. So therefore, it isn't taken off the employer's digital account or part of the negotiation that you make with the employer or you have with the employer about the price of the actual apprenticeship training and assessment. So these additional payments, such as the incentive payments, the learning support funding, disadvantage uplifts, etc., within the apprenticeship funding formula are not subject to the funding band maximum, and they're not calculated when you're actually working out what the price is that you're going to charge the employer. So it's very important. Now, if the employer wants to contribute to the cost of as a top-up, for example, to pay for residentials, etc., and you're not drawing that funding down from access to work, then that's their decision. But you've got to make sure that the funding for learning support is calculated and the cost is calculated accurately to reflect the full cost of supporting that learner. Now, one of you is asking, yeah, as a small provider, even if we identified it, we haven't got the staff to deliver it. That is a frequent issue, and I think it's something that's been picked up in a lot of the work that the Learning and Work Institute has talked about in terms of some of the issues that have been raised by employers when they've been surveyed. I think it's important, therefore, to understand that in that case, sometimes it's better for you, if you're a subcontractor, to make sure you work effectively with the main provider to ensure that their support systems, if they're a college or a big training provider, the learner can plug into their support systems, such as specialist support if it's a hearing impairment, sight impairment, or a moderate learning difficulty. If you're in a group of employers, working with smaller employers, why not work with other providers maybe to co-fund specialist support, as well as the training of your staff to identify and deliver some of it. The other question that one of you has asked, one way that we know roughly how much we should be claiming through learning support for apprentices is that on our non-apprenticeship programs, such as our study programs and our AAB, we've got data that shows that somewhere between 7 and 9% of the total funding is claimable as additional learning support. So therefore, we'd expect with that distribution to be reasonably similar for apprentices, and there's no reason why it can't be if they're typical of the whole population. Then that 7 to 9% of our total apprenticeship funding could be allocated to learning support. And for example, we have a £1 million contract for apprentices. We'd expect that we would be spending about £70,000 to £90,000 a year on learning support. And that's just using that rough and ready sort of, if you want, a metric. It's not accurate, it's just giving us an indication. Now, some years we might spend less than 70 to 90, some years, because we might have a very different set of needs, we might be spending more. The point is that we're large enough to have a support system that will be able to be put behind that funding. So in other words, we claim the funding, but we have got staff and we've got access to networks that allow us to then supply the additional support. So thanks for those sort of questions that you've posed, very useful. Here's an example of what I meant. We've got a 17-year-old apprentice on a 13-month level 2 apprenticeship. The total cost of learning support is £1,450. The claim, now what they're doing is we've matched the learning support for periods of time when they've got more off-the-job training We spread our 20% off the job training in an uneven way to maximize it. So sometimes those learners are coming into us 2 days a week, as opposed to what, day release might be just 1 day a week. So they're in with us month 1 and 2, month 6 and 7, and then month 12 and 13. So each one of those months, all of our learning support is being provided to them while they're in the institution doing the 20% off the job training. Each month we have a cost figure for how much support's provided for that individual, and you can see those cost figures sometimes are the same as 150, and in 5 of the months they're more. So ILR would allow us to claim £900. Actual cost, evidenced through receipts, invoices, timesheets, etc. We keep all of this evidence within one file. You might do it through Cognosys or whatever system you've got, and that comes to £1,450. So therefore, at the end of the year, our MI team would have claimed an additional £550 for that learner through the earnings adjustment statement. So 900 would have been claimed for the ILR, and £550 would have been claimed for the earnings adjustment statement. One of you's already asked, what kind of auditable evidence must you include? Well, since we use I know some of you might use Cognosys as your management system. We use Atlas, and that records every individual and how much is spent on them at every intervention, and that's backed up by timesheets, etc. Our normal cost of a tutor would be 40 to 50 pounds an hour. A learning support assistant, 18 pounds to 25 pounds. All of these costs are ones which have been tested by our auditors and have been seen as being reasonable. So that's just to highlight how. Now, obviously, to claim the funding, you've got to have the evidence of need, and you've then got to have the evidence of the fact that you've expended it. It is therefore important that you realise that this is coming from the ESFA, not from the levy, and not from co-investment. And obviously, if there is less funding available in the apprenticeship pot, there's less funding available for learning support. And clearly that leads to some of the issues that have been faced by those of us who have got shortages of learning support funding across other programs, such as study programs and other adults. How do you record it? Well, I've just put in the sections there that from the ILR that, and I'm sure you can pick these up with your MI team. I don't want to spend too much time on them. But what is important is that if you've got breaks in learning support, so you're not providing it consistently between the start date and end date. So you could provide it over 13 months at £150 a month. You can do it. But we have got breaks when sometimes the support's not being provided, and then other months when it is being supplied. Then obviously we've got a start date and an end date for each episode, a little bit more complicated. And as I said in section 80, if the period time recorded in the ILR is less than 1 calendar month, then you can't do this through the ILR, you've got to do it through the earnings adjustment statement. So this a little bit, it is important that you do record learning support accurately. And even, I know that, yeah, there's a question coming. You don't have to if you don't identify the learning support needs of an apprentice straight away before week 6, it's not an issue. Because if you find that the apprentice starts and a few months in, you can see that they've got an individual need, which means they're being held back on their progress. Then do the assessment and then put the plan in place, and then start claiming learning support from the point at which you've identified it and made the plan and then delivered the plan. So it doesn't have to be, yeah, I think the important point is it's when it's been identified, start claiming it. And obviously that comes out the total pot that you've got as part of your contract. I think that's going to be different in future. And it'd be interesting to see how much is held by the ESFA to support those other things which are not part of the price that's negotiated with the employer. If it's a levy-paying employer, yeah, I mean, the earnings, the apprenticeship service is basically looking after that bit that's about the levy plus the top-up and how that money is then coming out the employer's levy account. What's coming to you from the ESFA is a separate matter. It does relate to that individual learner and does relate to that employer, but it's not part of the actual price that you've charged that employer. I think hopefully that makes sense. In terms of access to work, how many of you, can I just ask, how many of you here are claiming access to work funding for any of your trainees or apprentices? Just can we have a quick show of hands? How many are claiming access to work funding for your apprentices or trainees? I'm just looking at the show of hands. We've got one. Yeah, we've got one.
It's just one anymore?
I think we've got one. I mean, obviously that might be either you're not aware of it, or yeah, we've applied and it's a right hassle. We have had a lot of issues over the application for access to work funding, the criteria that are applied, as well as the administrative burden associated with recording it. It is run by Job Centre Plus. They're really very much to give advice and practical support to disabled people to allow them to access the world of work and then to carry on working alongside their colleagues. So it's disabled people in a job, about to start a job, about to start a work trial, or who are self-employed. This obviously includes people on supported internships. Now, I know some of you are running supported internships, which are more intensive programs, including a large chunk of a work placement for learners with disabilities. However, when they become apprentices, it's important to realize that they might need to continue with the support. So the types of help can include adaptations to premises and equipment, which are often quite expensive, special aid, like assistive technology, support workers, on-the-job coaching, which is a very important aspect of inducting people into the world of work, travel to work where there's no practical public transport or travel within work, as well as training for colleagues. Now, some of these costs would not normally be associated with learning support. For example, training for your colleagues is not an eligible cost, and neither is some of the other things to do with travel. However, it is important to realize that the adaptations can be either in the workplace or wherever that person needs to have the adaptation take place. So it can be in the learning environment, if that's then going to help the person get into a job. So you could say it can be accessed in order for someone to be able to start a job or to do a supported internship. The maximum grant at the moment is £41,400 per year. So in some cases, by the way, if you're claiming support for a learner through access to work, it might actually mean that you will reduce the amount of support they get through the learning support. There's a classic example here. We've got a trainee who we're supporting for access to work. Because that's funded by Job Centre Plus, it means that the total cost of supporting that learner in the institution is less than £6,000. So they're no longer a high needs learner. So in other words, we've reduced the number of high need. We've got one less high needs learner funded through the ESFA, but one more person funded through access to work. In other words, you can't claim both, because then you'd have double funding for the same need or the same support. I think if you've not accessed it, it's worth thinking about and find out a little bit more about it. As I said, whether it be getting ready for a job or in a job, then I think it's important to look at the type of support you can provide. And I think the important thing here is that this has got to be against an identified need, and that is important when you're trying to help people get into work. I know it's a bit of a burden applying, providing all the evidence, agreeing the best support programs, making sure there's no double funding against any other support you might be getting, for example, for the ESFA, and then obviously accounting for it as well. And I know that one of you has just indicated that you've been put off because of the administrative burden. But for the one person doing it, if you can give us any comments about how helpful you think it is. And very often it is funding a lot of activity which would be very difficult to do without that source of funding, such as one-to-one job coaching when they're on a supported internship, as well as when they first start an apprenticeship program. Good. So we've got another source of funding there. Now, what this is really about is how do we improve the delivery, because there are some issues and problems in some providers, whether it be, and this goes right across training providers, colleges, local authorities, etc. And these are some of the things that have been identified, from a lack of coherent policy to relatively low levels of funding claims, which I think many of you would concur with, and one of you has already said that you claim nowhere near the 7 to 9% would be associated with maybe the other types of learners in your institution. Yeah, good, good. I think it's important, Mike, that the individual apprentice and any supporter does get in touch with their workplace and their HR team to make sure that they do apply for access to work. Access to work application has got to be a joint effort between the individual apprentice, their employer, and obviously with any advice that the provider can make, because that's the way in which it works. Well, good point there. You can see all these other things: poor identification and assessment of needs, lack of clarity, there's a lot of lack of awareness of individual needs. For example, lots of issues around mental health and well-being. Even where we've got the money, levels of support are inadequate or they're poor. Weak tracking and reporting systems, all of these have been identified either through inspection or through audit or through your own internal, or through feedback from learners and their advocates. So what sort of things do you think are going to bring this all to a head? Well, let's remind ourselves that improving the delivery of learning support and its quality will now have to be set in a new framework, as well as the obvious ESFA requirements, the requirements of access to work and Job Centre Plus, the requirements of the Act. We've also got the new Education Inspection Framework from the 1st of September. That's focusing much more on the quality of the curriculum, on the actual learning experience of the apprentice rather than the performance data, although they're still important. And what we've noted, by the way, is that apprenticeships are being retained as one of the 4 types of provision. So what Ofsted's going to be focusing on is what skills have the learners acquired, for example, since they started the apprenticeship program, how much challenge is there, what goals are there in terms of the broader curriculum, which includes obviously behaviour and attitudes and personal development, which are now separate grades, by the way, you'll see in the model there, how they're progressing. Very important for apprentices is what's happening in terms of long-term memory, how an apprentice can relate what they're doing now, which might be a different activity, a different unit, to what they did maybe 6 months ago or 12 months ago, and how we assess them both in summative terms as well as informative terms. So we're making sure that we're assessing for learning as well as assessing of learning. And then how do we put the whole lot into an effective framework or standard so all the bits fit together? And critically here is how well are we meeting the needs of individual apprentices who have got special education needs and or disabilities. So as you'll realize, the quality of the curriculum is a very important judgment that's going to be made that determines your overall effectiveness, as well as obviously leadership and management and the other 2. And there we've got the 3 I's, which are driving a lot of this. What is the intent of your apprenticeship program? How you what are its aims? How is it designed? How is it planned? How do you then deliver it, including the support for individual apprentices who have got individual needs? How do you assess them? And then what impact does it have? Has it closed the attainment gap? Do the apprentices have the apprentices who came in with individual needs, such as literacy, poor levels of literacy and numeracy, or a learning difficulty? How have they achieved? Have they achieved at the same rate? And have you closed the gap if there was an achievement gap, as well as what's happened in terms of the progression? So that is very important when you set this context of support for individual apprentices. Yeah, and I mean, I think Hayley, you're right to highlight that it's not, when I said the schema is critical, it's a much more holistic approach. The learning support can be just English and maths, but obviously associated with that will be other individual needs, such as the ability to learn, the ability to hold information. So memory obviously is critical, particularly memory of rules. And conventions, etc. So I think learning support can still just be English and maths, but around it that would be, I think, a much more holistic approach that says, well, what are the other things that are getting in the way of that apprentice being effective, particularly when it comes to learning English and maths, or any of the technical aspects of the program, or any qualifications, or, for example, endpoint assessment when they might be assessed through a test of some sort. So that's what I meant by that much more holistic approach, yes. However, the needs could still be English and maths, or relatively low levels of them. So we've got a curriculum that's a clear intent, And that includes what are we going to do and in the plan to support the individual apprentice with individual needs. How do we then implement it? And that means the structure of support comes into this, and inspectors will be looking at that. And inspectors will be looking at the impact of it. Has it closed the attainment gap? Has the learner with individual needs or disability, for example, been able to progress to higher levels of learning, or have they retained a job, etc.? So in the education inspection framework, when you look at the type of provision, the apprenticeships is one of the 4 types. These are the main things that will be considered when the inspectors are looking at the type of provision. So it's all the things we talked about, such as the initial assessment, the review points, the checking, the monitoring progress, offering clear support for those with SEND, as well as obviously making sure that your staff have got the right training. Now, inspectors will judge how well trainers, assessors, coaches and mentors communicate up to date. That also means in leadership and management, how well have you, the provider, trained your work-based learning staff, the tutors, in, for example, how to identify individual needs, how to provide learning support in terms of literacy and numeracy or other needs. So if you don't provide the CPD to allow your staff to effectively assess and deliver learning support, that would be seen as a significant weakness in your leadership and management, as well as obviously a weakness in the type of provision. And you can see that safeguarding is still an important aspect of it. So have a look at the new framework, at the quality of the curriculum, at leadership and management, as well as within the other 2, personal development, behaviour and attitudes, how they have relevance to learning support. So what I want to do now is to sort of finish off with sort of some ideas about how to improve in response to those problems, in response to the challenge, how can we do it? And I mean, essentially, the reason that we, and I'm talking here as a director of 2 training companies, member of a board of a college, which has got a large number of apprentices, of whom a large, significant proportion have got learning support needs, is we've made this essentially the workplace team's role to lead audit. So our workplace tutors, we don't call them assessors anymore, are fully conversant through training, through the training in the methodologies, through the training in the recording systems, how to assess and to support individual needs, and wherever possible to refer to specialists that are available within the institution, or if not, through our networks. So essentially, it's the work-based learning team, the apprenticeship team, that takes on this responsibility. What they'll then get is the support from a dedicated ALS team, which operates across the institution with other learners, whether it be study program learners or adults. So we have a clear line of responsibility for the assessment of support needs. So all learners have got to be assessed and have a rigorous initial assessment, which also assesses their prior learning. And then that means they can either be supported through the workplace tutor team, or we can refer them for specialist support from the dedicated ALS team. Our dedicated ALS team also trains our workplace tutors in some of the diagnostic tools, as well as in some of the support systems. So we have a very effective initial and diagnostic. I mean, if you have that right at the front end, through things like gap analysis, Quick Scans does that. There's other ones that, for example, long-term memory. I know some of you use cognitive assessment across the 8 domains. Cognosist is a good example there. Some of you might use performance and functional skills, goes back to what one of you said before. If that is 2 or 3 levels below what's required, that certainly is going to need additional support. Even the person might have excellent skills in some of the other cognitive areas, or in, for example, their ability to manipulate, etc. But we also identify at-risk learners, particularly with social needs, addictions, etc., and maybe past histories of poor retention. All of that goes into the piece, and then we have a very simple process for workplace tutors to apply. In other words, as they're recording all of the other information about the person that goes into the evidence file, that includes obviously all of these assessments. So we capture not only the initial assessments on each individual workplace tutor's file on that individual learner, we also record any activity of support. So for example, where one-to-one ALS is being provided during a review, that's automatically recorded. So for example, if I'm a workplace tutor and I'm working with someone, I've got one file on my iPad or my mobile phone. I record that of that 1.5 hours, I spent 15 minutes supporting that learner with that particular need. So that obviously goes straight into one file. Every time that happens, that's providing the evidence to claim the £150 per month. And in some cases, obviously, it'll be claiming more than 150. So we're using the existing record system, whether it be Pro Monitor, OneFile, whatever system you're using, to also now to record learning support. Now, can I just say, this did not happen straight away. I know one of you is already asking. That's a lot to ask of your workplace tutors. We gave them the training. It was important that we helped them to understand how important their role was in A, assessing, B, providing, and then obviously not only providing the support, but obviously then making the justification for the claims. And that's why we're almost up there around the 9% now in terms of the total value of all of our apprenticeship funding. And I think if it doesn't happen straight away, it will take time. The thing is to make it so simple, it is very easy for the workplace tutor who's got obviously lots of other things to do to actually apply. And that's what we found. We try to simplify it as much as possible and use the technology that's available. Good. Well, once the organisation is clear about who's responsible for assessing and providing the need and the tools to be able to do it, then what support do we provide? And we've used a lot of the targeted learning strategies that come out of the assessment and resources so that we can target for individual apprentices. Now, obviously, this is using a large chunk of time and funding that comes out the allocation we get and out the contract we get, but it means that we've been able to put assistive technology where, for example, words are turned into something that people can hear, vice versa. We've also used augmented and virtual reality for some of our apprentices, as well as some other adaptations, but also for some of our apprentices to find out what they need and how best to supply it. We've introduced some of the gaming technology. Now, I know there's a lot of stuff around on educational technology, but we found that by having targeted learning strategies, which kind of mean more one-to-one support for learners, we've been able to actually get a much more customized delivery, and this has clearly been helpful in a recent inspection of our one of the providers I'm a director of. So effective use of e-portfolio to record the types and duration, we've already mentioned that, but as you're seeing progress reviewed at regular tutorials, regular review meetings, we're showing what does the learner know, what skills have they got, what behaviours have they changed since the last review, and that includes where the learning support seems to be making an impact. We do provide a lot of one-to-one support and additional lessons for English and Maths, particularly where those have been identified as issues for the apprentice. And again, sometimes that means they do it when they come in through off-the-job training. When they do, in addition to the off-the-job training, we sometimes put on an hour and a half of English and Maths. That's in addition to the 20% off the job. Remember, that will often mean that where the learners, there's a small group maybe with very similar levels of need, then we will put them into that small group, or in some cases they have a one-to-one in that English and Maths class. We also have some one-to-one support, by the way, in some of the other stuff that's done as the 20% off the job. What we've said to those workplace tutors that have a fair number of learners with individual support is that their caseloads are reduced proportionally to reflect the additional work that they're doing, but also the additional funding that's coming in. But the biggest thing we did to make sure the delivery, this is all about implementation, was we gave and invested a lot of money in CPD and awareness raising for our workplace tutors, but also for the person they work with in the employer. Now that could be the training manager, it could be the owner, and or it could be the mentor that's allocated to that apprentice. And this is, by the way, it means that it's improved quite a lot of our own staff's English and Maths skills and awareness of things like mental health issues and well-being. But also it's been really useful, and our colleagues, for example, at Grimsby College showed this was quite an important thing, was to challenge some of the perceptions that employers had of how capable and able learners and apprentices were that had individual needs. So in terms of the implementation, the second I, we have a close liaison there between our specialist support staff and the apprenticeship team, and also with our internal work-based mentors. So that means that we bring the three parts of the triangle together: the learner together with the employer and their internal work-based mentors, and then us as the provider with the specialist support staff and apprenticeship team. So there's a communication so that we know what's happening to that individual learner, and if necessary, we have some case conferences where those needs are quite significant, for example, where we're drawing down a lot of support also through access to work. So that's the implementation. And then obviously making sure that those learners, wherever possible, if we've had them before they became an apprentice, how have we helped to get them ready for a job through traineeships and supported internships? We've done that. We've used a whole lot of alternative digital platforms, which I've just talked about. But we've also worked with specialist agencies. Please don't try and do all of this by yourself. And for example, when it comes to mental health issues, we work with a variety of local multi-agency teams where they're still available. We've also found that when we're sitting down working out the duration of a framework or standard, it is a good practice to say, well, if this is, normally 13, 14 months, in your case, it might be better to make it 15, 16, 17. That's okay. All you're doing is spreading your on-program element over a longer period, which you might need to do to ensure that person gets through. There's no reason why every single apprentice should have the same duration of their program. We're using things like buddy system, which we've found from Positive Outcomes, a training provider, and that is actually helping some of those apprentices, particularly early in their jobs, to get some one-to-one coaching and mentoring. We're using access to work funding through the employer there. Management of your data around progress of that learner and the spend is critical, and also it can record impact. So, if you're using Cognosys or ProMonitor or EBS, as I said, we use Atlas. And then try and work out what the impacts are of either the support programs you've had, and see what difference this is making in terms of impact. The third aspect of the curriculum, quality of curriculum. And also have a look at some of the case studies, because, I'm a small training provider. Well, have a look at what some small training providers have been able to do. And you can find that out through things like the Learning and Work Institute, which has got some case studies, ETF, Future Apprenticeship Toolkit. A good example of that is what's happening at Kirklees College to support apprentices with mental health. So quite a lot of places to go and get support. However, I think despite all of this, there are some key things that providers are still concerned about. The processes that, we've got to go through the needs identification, that chart you showed us applying for access to work funding. I think that, it may be off-putting, and it may make you think, well, we're not meeting the eligibility criteria, etc. I think it's important to say that do not be put off by some of these things, because ultimately, if the learner doesn't get the support and you can't provide the support and the funding isn't available, they might not complete the program. So therefore, you'll lose funding through non-completion, particularly if that happens fairly early in the program, as well as obviously losing the 20% completion element. And I think, but also that then affects your reputation and impacts on prospective numbers in future. Most providers are actually aware of learning support and disadvantaged funding, but few are aware of, for example, claiming more than £150 a month. And I've spoken to a fair number who were not aware of exceptional learning support when it came to more than 19,000. So I think it's important to recognise that, as well as the additional payments for 19 to 24-year-olds, the £1,000 incentive payment to you and incentive payment to the employer, and again, from today, access to work funding. But I think there's two things that very often you're coming up against: clear learning needs, as well as social and safeguarding support needs. And sometimes the two merge together. I think it's important to recognise that where that individual need is holding back the learning, and therefore the achievement of the apprenticeship, then that justifies learning support. Mental health, by the way, is seen now as an increasing feature. And I think that's something that we obviously have spent some time on in other webinars. But I think one of the things that really concerns a lot of us is that very few providers have calculated the benefits of learning support compared to the cost of investment in learning support. And I think essentially for every pound that we invest, either from our own funds or from the ESFA, we find that there is an improvement in retention, so therefore we earn more on program funding. We have better completions on frameworks and on standards, particularly endpoint assessments. We've therefore reduced the achievement gap, which of course is important as an impact measure for Ofsted, but also we're getting progression to higher levels. Those apprentices who have succeeded on a level 2 apprenticeship, many of them are now, because of the learning support needs being met, progressing to higher levels, progressing to better paid jobs, etc. So I think there are still some outstanding issues. It's going to take a bit of time to resolve them. I think a lot of providers and employers, because you can't forget their part in this. The employer is a key partner. Look at their commitment statement. We need to get more information out about what funding is available, how often we still meet both employers and providers who don't know about learning support funding, even in its essentials, and what kinds of things are available and what they can be spent on. You know, if you look at the things they can spend on, adaptation, smaller group size, additional staff, time, etc., extension of programs, whatever. Who's eligible? Anyone who's publicly funded through ESFA or through Job Centre Plus, eligible for the learning support. And so obviously those people who wouldn't be eligible to be supported on a core program wouldn't be supported for learning support. But also what the funding can be used for, you know, and it can be staffing, it can be coaching, all those things I've talked about, adaptations. You know, it can't be used to cover your overheads. You know, you can't use learning support to say, to fund, for example, your finance team or whatever, because that's assumed to be part of your normal expenditure. But it's those additional things which wouldn't have existed if you didn't have individuals with those needs. And then I think, although the evidence and supporting information is sometimes look onerous, using the technology and the management systems that I've talked about today, you know, Cognosys, whatever, OneFile, Pro, Monitor, that can actually help to make it easier, but also provide you with a lot of data that can then be mined in and used in different ways. So hopefully, you know, and the Learning at Work project, supporting apprentices with learning difficulties, I know which is several years old, but that was very much looking at what the Maynard task force, the Maynard an MP, it looked at some of those recruitment barriers and also looked at different ways of supporting people with learning difficulties and disabilities to undertake apprenticeships and other forms of work-related practice. And it's got lots of materials. Go on to the Learning at Work Institute and you'll find quite a lot of good project materials there, how-to materials, and also use things like the Inclusive Apprenticeship Toolkit, which I talked about previously. So hopefully that will get you moving. And so as a result of today, what do you need to focus on? Well, first of all, make sure you've got a clear policy, intent, and set of procedures that say, yeah, we're fully committed to identifying and meeting the needs of individual apprentices. We'll do this through learning support. Make sure you have the management structure underneath that and allocate and clear lines of communication. Who's responsible? The question I often ask is, who's responsible for identifying the individual needs of apprentices? Who's responsible for then planning it? Who's responsible for making sure it happens? Who's responsible for tracking it? Who's responsible for recording it? Make sure the resources are available. Now, get together with your main provider, if you're a subcontractor. Get together with other providers where you're too small to maybe do a lot of this yourselves. Do this through a forum, do it through a network. You might be able to share your expertise and share some of the costs. But you must make sure that you have put in place the recording, tracking, and reporting systems. When it comes to implementation, make sure you've got clear method for identifying and assessing needs, using things like BKSB or whatever to assess the levels of English and maths, and some of the others I talked about. Then have a clear plan, how you're going to deliver the support, and then implement and deliver that support. If you need to collaborate with your partners, either other providers, with your main provider, with the employer, or any specialist agencies, draw into the local authority or any of the charities that might support you. But I think the most important thing is have at the back of this clear impact measures so you can demonstrate in the new EIF and to your internal management systems, what has been the impact of all of this investment. So hopefully that's given you some idea of an update on the funding, some of the problems associated with delivering apprenticeship learning support to apprentices, some of the solutions in terms of intent, implementation and impact. Hopefully that's been useful. As Marek says, we've also got a slide there to tell you about our new offer. So if you're interested in following up on today's webinar, which of course don't forget is recorded and you get the slides too, then please take advantage of our latest offer. This is to all of you. It's £250 plus VAT on a whole range of topics where we've looked at recently, including updates on T-level funding. We've been looking at mental health needs. We've been looking at tutoring, effective tutorial. So you can see that we've got a wide range of things there. If you want to contact us, do so. Here's the contact details for any further information. Are there any more questions, Marek?
Just looking to see if there's anything I've missed. Not sure if there's anything. If I have, here's your last opportunity, but obviously you've got our contact details, and should you wish, you could always send us an email. I know the slides, the details have just popped off now off the screen, but it's not a problem. You'll all have our contact details when I send out the slides along with the video. But no, I don't think there's anything we've missed. There they go again, and that's for all of you watching on the video as well.
And I mean, one of the things that just to remind you is that, you know, if you're starting from a relatively low base of support in terms of the amount of funding and the amount of support, it's a good place, because at least you've identified it and you're getting some expertise and some experience. How to make it a bigger aspect, then obviously, you know, that requires you maybe looking at appointing some key staff or working in partnership with another provider that, you know, you can trust, etc., to maybe come up with some joint solutions. But particularly those of you subcontractors, make sure you do use the support systems available by the main provider. I think we can close the recording down and now at this point. Thank you, everyone.
No problem at all. Like I say, if you're watching this on the video recording and you have any questions, please get in touch. Thank you.